Auditor John Mark L. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Oscar and Arsinia Auditor. Ayag Chan Rafi B. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ramel and Ranifi Ayag. Ayag Stephen E. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rolando and Marivic Ayag. Bermo J. B. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Babbitt and Prima Bermoy. Busio Emmanuel G. Parents, Mrs. Emma Busio.
Busio Jovan C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Francisco and Jovelyn Busio. Elie RJP. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rogelio and Estrella Elie. Elie Leomar G. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Sunday and Marlene Elie. Eroy Ryle E. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Susiniano and Annabel Eroy. Otohot Jandrel T. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jose and Rebecca Hotuhot.
Waton Niljan P. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Winard and Evelyn Watton. Kiamko Kim R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jesus and Tersa Kiamko. Labrador Raymar C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Randy and Rebecca Labrador. Ladra Kyle Lawrence E. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson and Lolita Ladra.
Libres Clifford. Parents, Mrs. Yostica Libres. Latino Alexander P. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Sunday and Delia Platino. Latino John Clark V. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Loreto and Severina Platino. Salao Justin V. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Arnel and Gina Salao. Tikling Zeus Miguel A.S. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Dennis and Jovencia Tikling.
Tutor Mark Lawrence. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ronaldo and Maricor Tutor. Vallejos Jason N. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Vitaliano and Maritis Vallejos. Bellusino John Leo I. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Francisco and Violeta Bellusino. Aray Eliza Jane S. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Dax Corbett and Melody Aray.
Balaba Sarah G. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roy and Shirley Balaba. Baliero Nicole G. Mr. and Mrs. Apolinar and Adele Baliero. Bernante Beth Audrey. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Joseph and Mary Ann Bernante. Busio Yunesfi F. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Edmond and Felipa Busio. Cadigal Donalyn. Parent, Mrs. Janeline Cadigal.
Cadigal Jessica L. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Andy and Julieta Cadigal. Cadigal Maridin D. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Dindo and Marisa Cadigal. Cadigal Vena T. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Victoriano and Anita Cadigal. Diana Riame A. Parents, Mr. Raymond and Miriam Diana.
Elie Valerie B. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Felixberto and Terencia Elliott. Elioremo Abigail V. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Danilo and Alicia Elioremo. Escobal Antoinette P. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ricardo and Exoperia Escobal. Motohot Raizi T. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Benji and Mary Ann Motohot.
Lagrimas Carla May S. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Benny and Stella Lagrimas. Lianto Princess Nicole S. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Mateo and Michelle Lianto. Magbanwa Tricia C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Edwin and Marilyn Magbanwa. Yano Dayan Alexis A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Glenn and Elizabeth Miano. Ulahay Charmaine B. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Samuel and Rosemary Ulahay.
Auntie Marilyn A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ronald and Arlene Pante. Recalde Mary Joy T. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Angelo and Maricho Recalde. Tinaco Janelle L. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. William and Esteria Tinaco. Tutor Lauren Grace R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Lucito and Graciana Tutor. Valiespen Annabel C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Marciano and Marlene Valiespen.
Byron Pauline B. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rodolfo and Marilo Byron.